Wyoming Territory. November 1887. The snowstorm doesn't warn you before it buries you. It just falls. A woman stands alone in a frozen yard, splitting wood before the light fails. Her breath comes out in white puffs. Her hands don't shake. 3 years alone on this land has a way of burning the shake out of a person. Then she hears the horses, too many. Coming from the wrong direction, she counts them without looking up. 3. The kind of men who don't travel in threes unless someone sent them. Inside the cabin, 12 steps away, a shotgun waits above the stove. She doesn't run, she should run. The snow keeps falling. The horses keep coming. And somewhere above the north ridge, moving through the timber without a sound, something enormous is already watching. Blood tastes like old pennies. Clara Boone knew this the way she knew the distance from the splitting block to the cabin door. The way she knew which floorboards would give under weight and which would hold. Not from study, but from experience paid for in full. She was 30 years old, and she had been running this property alone for 3 of them. And the education the land provided was thorough and did not offer refunds. November in the Harlow Valley arrived without negotiation. The first hard freeze had come 2 weeks ago, locking the creek into black glass and turning the yard mud into something closer to iron. And the sky today had the low, bruised quality of a ceiling that intended to come down. She needed the firewood split and stacked before the light failed. In Wyoming in November, the light failed early and completely, dropping behind the western ridge the way a trapdoor opens. One moment there, the next gone. She set the maul head against the splitting block and straightened up. 3 horses on the north ridge. Coming down through the timber, she did not run for the cabin. Her father had taught her that running showed something, and what you showed out here was what you became in the eyes of whoever was watching. She stood with her hands loose at her sides and tracked their descent through the scrub oak and the bare aspen, counting them, reading their pace. Not the ambling approach of travelers looking for water, deliberate. Spread across the trail in a formation that was not accidental. 3 weeks ago, a trapper named Garrett had come through on his way to Harlow with pelts and information. He ran the Eastern Canyon lines twice a season and knew the valley the way men know country they have moved through alone for years, by its sounds and its changes, by what belonged and what did not. He had told her that Dolan Wreck had been seen in Harlow, asking questions, not the questions a buyer asks when he wants to negotiate, the questions a man asks when the decision has already been made at a level above him, and what remains is the logistics of implementation. Aldous Crane wanted the south end of this valley. His geological men had identified a silver shelf running beneath the canyon floor, and to reach it from the north he needed the creek access, the wagon road, and the 32 acres her father had broken from raw ground 30 years before she was born. 2 ranches north of hers had changed hands in the past 18 months. The Pruitt family, who had been in the valley since before Wyoming achieved territorial status. Old man Caswell, who had no children left to argue on his behalf. Both gone before the first snow. Garrett had drunk his coffee and left before the afternoon light changed. She had spent the 3 weeks since with the information sitting in the back of her accounting, like a debt she could see coming but not yet calculate. The rider in front sat his horse with the ease of a man who had never been surprised by the consequences of his own decisions. He wore a buffalo hide coat with the collar turned against the wind, and a low-crowned hat positioned at an angle that was chosen rather than settled into. His jaw moved in the slow rhythm of a man working tobacco, or simply working, the habitual motion that keeps certain men from having to occupy their own silence. He was not young, not old. He had arrived at the specific age that comes from having done enough damage that you stop being surprised by your own capacity for it. Dolan Wreck. Garrett had described him well enough. The 2 men flanking him were different from each other in the way that tools designed for different purposes are different. The one on the left was built low and wide, with hands visible even from this distance that looked disproportionate even to his large frame. The kind of hands that serve as their own argument. He rode without expression, without apparent awareness of the cold. The one on the right was spare and strung tight in the way that wire fencing is spare, nothing wasted, every component under tension. His left shoulder twitched at intervals. His eyes moved constantly, scanning the yard, the cabin, the tree line, the barn, her, the splitting block, her again. She held still under the scan. They reined in at the yard's edge, 10 yards from where she stood, Rex swung down from his horse and pulled his gloves off finger by finger, which told her what she needed to know about how he understood this visit. His hands were clean. Not the clean of a man who washes after hard work, but the clean of a man who does not do hard work, who has other arrangements for that. His voice when it came was professionally unremarkable. A voice that had delivered difficult information so many times it had stopped registering the difficulty. Mr. Crane asked me to come personally. He stopped 6 feet from her. He's prepared to be generous. More than the market would suggest, given the seasons and your circumstances. He'd like to conclude this before the deep freeze sets in. I know why you're here. She kept her voice at the same register his was. Garrett talked, a pause that occupied less than a second and communicated that he had anticipated this. Garrett talks to a lot of people. The answer is the same as it was in October. She wrapped both hands around the maul handle, not as threat, just as fact. This land is not for sale. Rec looked at her with an expression that was not patience and not contempt, but something more refined than either. The practiced assessment of a man who has heard refusal before and has developed a reliable process for working around it. Mrs. Boone, he said it with the weight of a man who has done his research, who knows she is widowed, who has filed that detail away as structural information. The valley is going to change regardless. The question is whether you find yourself on the right side of the change or the wrong one. My side is the one with my name on the deed. Winter is a difficult time to be managing a place this size alone. There it was, not a threat, better than a threat. An observation about weather and solitude assembled into a shape that meant everything and nothing at once, that left no handprint on anything that she could not point to. She looked past him to the 2 men still mounted. The thin one's shoulder was moving again. The large one had not shifted since they stopped, absorbing his horse's weight adjustments without looking down. There's a trough on the east side, she said. If your horses need water, use it. Then take the north trail back. Rex smiled. The smile of a man who keeps smiling in the same drawer as everything else he uses. He nodded once, and the large man dismounted, not the dismount of a man stretching after a long ride. The dismount of a man who has been given a direction and is executing it. Clara understood this in the same instant. She understood that 12 steps was suddenly a very specific distance, and she was running the calculation before she had decided to run it. She broke for the cabin. She made 9 steps before he caught the back of her coat. Her father's coat, heavy wool, and the seam at the shoulder gave with a sound that she would remember afterward as sharper than it should have been. She twisted inside the grab, got her elbow backward and into the bridge of his nose. The connection was solid. She felt it to her shoulder socket and heard a sound that was mostly surprise. She cleared the porch steps. Her hand was reaching for the door handle when Rex's hand closed around her wrist, stronger than he looked. That was the last surprise available to her, because the large man's shoulder hit the door before she had it fully open, and the impact drove the wood into her arm, and she went sideways into the doorframe. The collision was complete and specific. Her shoulder against pine, the numbness that follows impact before the pain arrives to explain what happened, and then the pain arriving in a long hot wave from shoulder to fingertips. She fell into the cabin. Cold ash smell from the banked stove. The indoor chill of a room unheated since morning. She was moving before she fully understood she was on the floor, reaching for the table edge, hauling herself towards standing. And then the thin man was through the door with his hands finding her waist, and she stopped thinking and started operating. The cast iron skillet hung on the stove's side rail. Her grandmother's pan, 12 inches of solid iron that she had been cooking on for 3 years, and she got both hands on the handle and swung without a backswing, connecting with the thin man's temple in a motion that was less deliberate than automatic. The iron made contact with a sound that was dense and wrong, and he dropped without ceremony, hands sliding off her waist, knees folding, gone. 2 left. Rec came through the door with his face altered, the professional patience stripped back, something older and more direct visible underneath it. The large man filled the doorway behind him. Afternoon light fell through the window in a single shaft and caught the dust disturbed by the fight. 1,000 particles hanging suspended in the cold air, and for the span of one breath everything was still. She swung the skillet again. Rec ducked. The large man stepped in and caught her wrist in a grip that felt mechanical, a hinge closing on a hinge. and the bow bones in her forearm registered each other in a way they were not designed to. Her fingers released the skillet without her permission. She heard it hit the floor from a distance that was not actually a distance. Rec hit her, not a slap. A closed fist with shoulder weight behind it, knuckles to the jaw. The world tilted in one direction, and then the floor came up from another, and there was nothing available to do about it except get her hands in front of her face, which she mostly managed. The left side of her face met the floorboards. The boards were cold, and the splinters in the dry rotted wood found her cheek immediately, and the taste in her mouth went copper and immediate. She lay on her side and watched dust motes move in the window light while her ears produced a high sustained tone that crowded out everything else. A boot planted itself in the small of her back and the pressure was immediate and total. She could not draw enough air to do anything with. The panic came then. Not the managed alarm she had been running on since the horses appeared on the ridge, but something older and more animal, a physical terror that bypassed everything she had spent 3 years building. Her body bucked and her fingernails dragged against the floorboard grain, leaving thin red lines on the pale wood. She tried to bite the boot. Got leather and nothing else. She heard Rec above her, his voice thicker now through his damaged nose. Hold her. The pressure increased. Her vision began to close at the edges, the specific tunneling that is not darkness but its approach. She could feel the cold of the floor through her sleeves where they had ridden up. She could feel her own heartbeat behaving badly in her chest. She thought, this is the floor her father built. These are men who do not know and do not care that this is the floor her father built, she thought. Not yet. She arched her back and got her elbows under her and dragged herself 1 inch forward, 1 inch. Her palms left 2 thin blood smears on the dusty wood. She dragged another inch, the boot heel grinding harder into her spine, and she dragged another inch regardless, because when the available options reduce to 1, you execute the one option and you do not stop executing it. Then the light in the doorway disappeared, not gradually. The rectangle of grey November afternoon was there, and then it was replaced entirely, and before she could process what had replaced it, the door hinges shrieked as the wood was driven backward, and the sound was so abrupt and absolute that the boot on her spine lifted a fraction. She turned her head. Through the swollen slit of her left eye, she saw him. Eli Strand did not look like a man who had walked out of the tree line. He occupied the doorway the way a geographic feature occupies space, not arriving so much as having always been a possibility that had now become actual. 6.5 feet of him, with shoulders that made the door frame recalculate its own dimensions. He wore a coat made of elk hide, the fur worn flat in the places where a pack rode and wild everywhere else, and he smelled of pine resin and cold air and something metallic underneath both, and the dusting of snow on his hat and shoulders had been accumulating for hours, the way snow accumulates on things that do not move. He did not announce himself, did not offer terms or conditions. He stepped inside and crossed to Rec in 2 strides that were quiet under the elk hide, and he took the man's face in one hand, his fingers wrapped around jaw and cheekbone the way most hands wrap around a mug. Rec's protest was muffled into something unintelligible, and the large man did not pull back to swing. He simply torqued his wrist and drove the back of Rec's skull into the heavy ceiling beam that ran the cabin's length. The sound was hollow and final. Rec folded at every joint simultaneously and landed in a heap on the floorboards with the absolute physical certainty of someone who is no longer making decisions. The large man reacted. He came off Clara's spine to reach for the revolver at his hip, and she gasped the air back into her lungs while above her the sequence continued. Eli moved inside the drawer before it completed, his left forearm across the gun hand, his right hand closing on the large man's throat. What followed was not theatrical. It was the kind of efficiency that has no performance in it, that exists only in people who have dealt with serious physical threat enough times that the response has become involuntary. The large man weighed what large men weigh, and Eli Strand lifted him off the floorboards anyway and drove his knee upward, and the sound of ribs was loud enough that Clara heard it clearly from the floor. He put the man down, not gently, but not with unnecessary force. The large man found the iron stove on his way to the floor and his arm caught the hot metal surface, and the sound he made then was different, higher and less controlled, and he folded into the corner with both arms across his shattered chest. The thin man, the one Clara had put down with the skillet, was beginning to stir. His eyelids moved. Eli looked at him with the brief, assessing attention of someone managing a list of tasks, walked over and kicked him once at the temple. The movement stopped. The cabin went quiet. Not the quiet of absence, but the weighted quiet of aftermath, the silence that was waiting on the other side of the noise the whole time. The only sounds were the large man's labored breathing from the corner and the wind keening through the damaged door frame. Eli stood in the center of the room. He looked at the three men in sequence, taking inventory. Then he looked at Clara. "Get your trash out of my sight." The voice was lower than she had expected, a register below the ordinary, a slow roll of sound that seemed to come from somewhere in the floor before it reached her ears. He was looking at the large man when he said it. "If I find any of you east of the North Pass again, I won't use my hands." The large man did not argue. He could not argue physically, and seemed to understand this with the clarity that broken ribs provide. He hauled himself to the door and down the porch steps and across the yard, and she heard him in the direction of the horses, making sounds that were mostly pain. Eli bent, took Rec by the coat collar, and dragged him out with the sustained, effortless pull of a man moving weight that does not represent a challenge to him. He did the same with the thin man. She heard both bodies in the yard snow. She used the time to get to the far wall. Her legs were functional in the way that things are functional when they are operating on reserves. She reached the wall mount above the stove and pulled the shotgun down and got both hammers cocked, and the double click in the small room was the loudest deliberate sound she had made since the door went off its frame. She turned. Eli Strand was back in the doorway. He stopped. He looked at the barrels first, then at her face. Not with surprise, with the careful reading of a man assessing a situation before he assesses the person presenting it. He raised both hands, slowly, with a deliberateness that was not performance but communication, each movement showing her what his hands were doing before they did it. His palms were enormous, scarred across the knuckles in the thick white way of old injuries, stained in the deep grain of the skin with earth and grease that no soap was ever going to fully reclaim. The hands of a man who has been using them hard for a long time and intends to continue. They're gone, quiet, factual, don't move. Her voice came out, dragged over something, raw and damaged. She coughed, which cost her. The ribs reported immediately, and the cough told him something about her condition that she had not chosen to share. Don't take one step. He did not take one step. He stood in the doorway with his hands up and the grey November light framing him from behind, and he watched her with the stillness of someone who has learned that patience is not a virtue but a practiced skill, and has practiced it past the point where it requires effort. Her arms were shaking. The shotgun weighed what it always weighed, but her body had been making withdrawals for 20 minutes from accounts she had not known had limits, and the shaking was the accounts informing her they were nearly empty. Minutes passed. Neither of them moved. "You can put it down," he said finally. The unhurried certainty of it, or pull the trigger. But if you hold it much longer, it's going to reach the floor before you decide. She hated that he was right. The barrel dropped an inch, then another. She let the weight finish the work, and the stock met the floorboards. And she kept both hammers cocked, but leaned back against the wall and slid down it until she was sitting with her knees drawn up, the shotgun across her feet. Eli lowered his hands. He did not move toward her. He stayed where he was for a moment, reading the room, and then he stepped inside and pressed the broken door into its frame. The grey light narrowed and was gone. He moved to the wash basin, found the ceramic pitcher, poured water into the bowl, found the cloth draped over the chair back, dipped it, wrung it. He walked across the room and crouched 4 feet in front of her, which put him below her sightline despite the crouch being architecturally ambitious for a man his size, and he held the damp cloth out between them. She flinched, small, but real. Her shoulders came up and her hand moved toward the shotgun, and she pressed herself back and he stopped. He did not close the remaining distance. He held the cloth in the space between them, in the way you hold something out to a creature that has every rational reason not to trust you, and you are acknowledging the rationality of its position. "Your cheek," he said. The floor got to it. She looked at the cloth. She looked at his hand. She took it from him fast, the quick, decisive motion of someone who has made a decision they are not entirely comfortable with, and pressed it to her face. The sting was immediate, and she pressed harder, using the information it provided. The cloth came away red dark in a patch smaller than her palm. Not deep enough for stitches. She had been through worse and would not spend time on this one. He stood, walked to the stove. He loaded the firebox from the wood box without asking whether she wanted him to, struck a match against his thumbnail in a single motion, and put it in. The kindling caught. You didn't have to kill them. Her voice was recovering. The cynicism returning with the recovery, which she recognized as a good sign, because cynicism was her working armor, and its return meant she was operational again. Didn't kill them. He adjusted the damper with the ease of a man who has operated this model of stove before, or one close enough to it. The big one will feel the ribs every time it rains. The jaw will set crooked. They won't come back. Rec works for someone. He'll send more. He turned his head. His eyes found hers across the room and held. Gray in this light, the gray of struck flint, carrying the specific quality of certainty that only comes from having been tested in ways most people encounter in description rather than experience. Not these three, he said. The fire was building. She felt the first pulse of warmth in the room. I didn't need your help, she said it, because some lies are load-bearing, and this particular one had been holding things up for 3 years, and she was not ready to remove it from the structure yet. He walked back and sat in the wooden chair opposite her. The chair made an inquiry about the proposition under his weight but held. I know, he said. She narrowed her functional eye. You know. You were watching. I came in when you were down. Before that, you were fighting. A pause that contained no apology and no qualification. You hadn't stopped. I've watched men with considerably more to lose than you give it up the moment it stopped being easy. You didn't? The thing that happened in her chest when he said it was not what she had prepared for. She had been braced for the particular flavor of patronizing's admiration men sometimes offer women who survive things. The commendation that is also a reminder of how surprising the survival was. This was not that. This was recognition, the kind that does not require softening. She buried her chin in her knees. Nobody stops out here. 3 years on this property and people ride past. They look somewhere else. I was running a line on the eastern bench. He looked at the fire now. Heard the horses come in wrong. Too many for this property at this hour. Then I heard the wood break. He paused. I don't have a use for men who travel in packs. He stood again. She was going to have to recalibrate her sense of how space worked with this man in a room. He went to the door, examined the hinge damage, stepped outside. She heard him in the lean-to beside the barn, heard the deliberate sound of someone who knows where tools are kept or is willing to look until they find them. The hammer that followed was patient and steady, the sound of a problem being resolved rather than forced. She stayed on the floor while he worked. Not because standing was unavailable, but because the floor was honest, and the chair would require a posture she was not yet able to maintain. Her ribs communicated every breath past a certain depth. Her right wrist had taken the full mechanical force of the large man's grip, and the skin had already turned the colors of a storm system, purple and swollen in a band around the bone. When she tried to close her right hand fully, the tendon sent a clear message up to her elbow. She considered the shotgun between her feet. She thought about picking it up. She decided not to, and then sat with what it meant to have made that particular decision about a stranger who was currently rehanging her door. When he came back inside, the door swung true, and the latch engaged with the solid click of hardware doing what it was made to do. He stood at the threshold. She had been calculating since he walked in. What did he want? What could she offer? What would this cost? She had a practiced response prepared for what came next, which was the part where a man who had done something significant began to discuss what he expected in return. The frontier ran on this economy. She had operated inside it long enough to know all the exchange rates. He looked at her on the floor, the bruised eye, the blood-stiff cheek, the whole situation of her. And when he spoke, his voice had dropped in volume, not in softness but in register, pitched for a smaller distance. You fight like a cornered wolverine. The rough grain of it, that's a way to stay alive. But you shouldn't have to do it by yourself. He turned, looking out toward the canyon where the last gray light was pulling back from the snow. You won't have to. Not anymore. It was not a declaration. It had none of the architecture of romantic promise or heroic vow. He said it the way you state something about the weather that is simply going to be true, with the flat certainty of a man who has examined a situation and arrived at a conclusion he is not interested in revising. He did not wait for her to respond. He stepped out onto the porch and pulled the repaired door shut behind him. and she was alone with the firelight and the blood in her mouth, and a strange slow loosening in the region of her sternum, as though something that had been maintained under continuous tension for a very long time had released a single coil. She stayed on the floor for a while longer. The fire built itself by degrees. The cabin warmed from the corners inward, the cold retreating to the gaps in the chinking and then out into the night. She pressed the damp cloth to her cheek until it dried against the wound, and she had to peel it back carefully, using information rather than gentleness, because gentle costs energy she did not have. When she finally got herself to standing, it took 2 attempts and a negotiation with her ribs that she lost partially and won partially. She crossed to the small cracked mirror above the washstand and looked at herself in the lamp's yellow light. The left side of her face had registered the full accounting of Rex's knuckles. The eye was reduced to a dark slit between swollen lids already moving through the first 2 shades of bruise. A shallow laceration traced her cheekbone where the floorboard had found her, its edges dried dark. Her lip had split at some point she could not specifically remember. She looked at herself without grief and without self-pity, because she had already paid those dues on earlier nights, and there was nothing left of either for this one. She looked with the flat assessment of someone taking stock. Damage manageable. Function impaired but present. Continue. She found the medicinal whiskey behind the lye soap, poured a splash onto clean cloth, did not hesitate before pressing it to the laceration. The burn was total and immediate, and she gripped the washstand edge with her good hand and breathed through it in slow counts until it reduced to something manageable. A sound from outside. She was at the shotgun before she finished identifying it, and then she identified it. Iron on wood, regular, patient. Not the sound of something approaching, but the sound of something working. She went to the window and moved the burlap an inch. He was sitting on the porch edge with his back against the cabin wall, a hunting knife in one hand and a piece of scrap pine in the other, shaving long curled ribbons of wood onto the frozen ground. His enormous frame had made itself comfortable against the logs in the way that a man makes himself comfortable in conditions that would be serious problems for other people. At his feet, folded tight, was a canvas bedroll. He was not coming inside. He had assessed the situation and concluded that his place tonight was between her and whatever came next. Not because she had asked, not because anyone had negotiated it, because he had looked at what the situation required and was providing it. She let the burlap fall, she moved the rocking chair close to the stove and sat with the shotgun across her knees. Through the door she could hear the slow regular scrape of his knife against the pine. Not stopping, not starting. Just continuous. A sound that said something large and capable and awake was out there in the dark, stationed between her and the night would have to account for that before it got to her. She did not sleep. But she sat, and she breathed, and she listened, and somewhere past midnight she understood that she had stopped listening for the approach of something wrong. She was just listening. That was its own kind of thing, and she did not examine it too closely. Dawn arrived in the way Wyoming dawns arrive in November. Not a gradual lightening, but a sudden decision. The eastern gap in the canyon walls going from black to blue to white in the span of 10 minutes. She heard him before she opened the door. The splitting maul, but different from when she used it. Her strokes were effortful, each one a small contest between her and gravity. His was something else entirely. A clean mechanical rhythm. Blade rising and falling with the economy of a movement so thoroughly practiced it had stopped requiring conscious direction. Crack. Crack. She opened the door. The cold entered her lungs with the precision of something with a point. A heavy frost had settled over everything in the night, coating the scrub oak branches, the trough surface, the yard in a white that was exact and complete. Her breath came out in a long visible plume. He was at the splitting block with his elk-hide coat draped over the porch rail, working in a faded flannel shirt with the sleeves pushed past his elbows despite the temperature. She could see the forearms from where she stood, the roped muscle and the distribution of old scars, the record of 7 years in country that kept score in its own way. He paused, set the axe head on the block. He looked at her the way he had looked at the room when he first stepped into it, not cataloging her as a person, but reading her as a situation. The wrist cradled against her stomach, the way she held her left side, the particular quality of her stillness that was not calm but the active management of pain. Ribs, he said. Not a question, bruised, a beat, possibly cracked, wrap them. Strips of sheeting. If you breathe too deep without support, you'll pull a muscle on top of what you've already got. He gathered an armload of split wood and carried it inside without asking whether this was acceptable, deposited it beside the stove, and went back out for the water bucket, which he filled at the creek and set on the washstand. She stood in the doorway. "I can manage that," she said. He looked at her wrist. Not this morning, which was accurate, which was the aggravating quality it shared with most things he said. He knelt by the stove and built the fire from the banked coals in the unhurried way of a man who has done it in conditions that made a cold Wyoming morning seem like adequate shelter. A thread of smoke, a lick of orange, then solid combustion. He closed the iron door. "I've run this place on my own for 3 years," she said from the doorway. He stood. He was too tall for the cabin's low ceiling and made a small automatic adjustment to keep his head clear of the beam. He turned to face her. "Yesterday you almost died on your own. Both things are true, no malice in it, no instructive point being made about her limitations, just the accounting." She stared at the broad back of his flannel shirt for a moment. "Who are you?" He wiped his hands on his canvas trousers. "Turned fully, Eli, just the one name. No history offered alongside it, no explanation of what had come before or what he intended to come after. Clara Boone." She lifted her chin despite what it cost her. "This is my land, I know. Then you know I didn't ask for help." No, something shifted in the gray of his eyes. Not amusement, not precisely understanding, some third thing that occupied the space between the two. "You didn't?" He took his coat from the porch rail on his way past her. "Your horse needs hay. The rabbit on the washstand. I ran a line this morning before you were up. Water bucket's full." He was already crossing the yard toward the barn, his boots leaving clean deep prints in the frost. She turned back into the cabin. The water bucket was full, brimming with water so cold it was almost viscous. The rabbit lay on a piece of clean canvas beside it, dressed with the efficiency of someone who has performed the task thousands of times in conditions that made this look comfortable. The fire was going. The wood was stacked, all of it done before she woke. Clara stood in the center of her cabin and looked at each of these things in turn. Something in her chest, some muscle she had been holding under continuous contraction for 3 years. So long she had stopped registering the effort, let go the smallest possible amount. She did not examine this. She picked up the rabbit and went to work. 3 weeks. That is the span in which two people who have decided not to trust each other can build something that operates like trust, not through conversation, not through declaration, but through the accumulation of small evidence. The way water builds a canyon, one day after another, each unremarkable by itself, the pattern only visible when you look back at the distance covered. Eli Strand slept on his canvas bedroll beside the stove. Clara slept behind the burlap partition on her narrow cot. Neither of them discussed this arrangement. It became the arrangement the way certain things do when neither person has the energy to contest it, and both people quietly find it workable. The days organized themselves around the work, which in a Wyoming November was not a finite list, but a continuous generation of necessity. Eli took the outdoor tasks. Not because she couldn't do them, they both understood she could, but because the wrist needed 2 more weeks before she could swing anything with significant force, and neither of them was going to pretend otherwise. She did the indoor work. The cooking, which she was accurate about not doing well, the mending, which she did adequately, the firearms, which she cleaned with the focused competence of someone who had learned that the difference between a gun that functions and one that doesn't is 10 minutes of daily attention. She burned the bread the first 3 mornings, not catastrophically, just enough to produce the darker smell, the bottom crust going from acceptable to something that required a decision. She didn't apologize for it and he didn't comment, just ate what was in front of him with the steady focus he brought to everything, working through the burnt sections without varying his pace. The 4th morning, she got it right. She wasn't certain what had changed. Possibly the cabin temperature, warmer now that the stove was fed consistently. Possibly the flour which Eli had moved to the north wall of the storage room without consulting her, which had made her furious for precisely 20 minutes before she acknowledged he was right about the moisture, and decided to remain furious about the principle indefinitely. She set the loaf on the table between them. He cut a piece. He ate it. Better, one word. It should not have been satisfying in any proportion, And yet, she cut her own piece and looked at the fire the way he looked at it, and for 10 minutes neither of them said anything, and the silence between them had a different weight than it had been carrying. Less like two people watching each other across a contested line. More like two people who had been running hard and had, at the same moment and without coordinating it, agreed to stop. The argument came on day 6. She went into the storage room and found that he had reorganized everything. Not just the flour which she had told him he could deal with, but the salt blocks, the dried beans, the lard tins, the paper-wrapped venison she had put up in October. Reorganized with a logic she could follow but had not requested. And the time, her father's time, grown and dried and hung in bundles from the ceiling, had been moved to the left side, where it had never hung in 30 years of her father's life, or 3 years of hers. She found Eli outside the barn, running a whetstone along the felling axe blade. You moved everything in the storage room. The stone kept its circuit, east walls taking moisture. Anything sitting against it goes soft by February. I know my own storage room. Then you know the east wall, a pause in the motion. Your beans were starting to spot. Don't rearrange my things without asking. I asked about the flour 2 days ago. You said do what you want with it. This was technically accurate. She had said exactly that, in the tone people use when they mean the opposite and expect the other person to decode the difference. This required a familiarity they did not yet have, and he had apparently taken her at her precise word, which was either obtuse or deliberate, and she did not yet know him well enough to determine which. She was assembling a response when he said, without looking up from the whetstone, Ruth did the same. East wall first with this type of construction. She'd have moved it in October. Clara stopped. He had said the name the way you say a word in a language you haven't spoken in a long time. Carefully, feeling whether it still fits, whether the shape of it holds. Not with drama, just with the recognition of something that mattered being named. She didn't ask. The question formed itself fully, and she held it back, because some things require more than 6 days of proximity before they have the right context. She went back inside and returned the time to the right side of the ceiling, where it had always been, and left everything else where he had put it. She thought about the name Ruth for the rest of the day, and did not speak it aloud. On night 11, she woke to a sound she could not immediately place. She lay on her cot with her hand already at the cot's edge, moving from sleep to alertness in the manner of someone who had been sleeping alone in a property that required vigilance for 3 years. Then she identified it, not exterior, not threatening in the way she had been trained to recognize threat. From the other side of the burlap partition, the sound of a body fighting something that was not in the room, not a scream, not anything declarative. The compressed physical resistance of a man who was somewhere else in his sleep and was not winning. She lay still and listened to the specific quality of it. She got up. She went through it the way she went through everything. What did she know? What did she not know? What were the variables? She did not know what he was like when startled from this kind of sleep, in a dark cabin, in a situation that was already carrying its own weight of recent violence. The unknown variable was not one she could plan around. She carried her chair around the partition and set it 3 feet from where he was lying. He was on his back, one hand locked in the canvas of the bedroll with a grip that had turned his knuckles the color of bare wood. His jaw was rigid. His chest moved too fast. She did not touch him. She opened the stove's iron door and added 2 cuts of hickory, adjusted the damper so the fire caught and held. The crackling filled the room, not loud but present, the sound of something burning steadily and without crisis. And the light it threw moved across the ceiling in the slow, warm way of a fire that is doing its job. She sat back in the chair. She did not watch him directly. She watched the fire and listened to it and let time pass. And some time in the unmarked minutes his hand began to release its grip on the canvas. Finger by finger, the tension leaving in the same sequence it had arrived, and his jaw unlocked, and his breathing found a different, slower rhythm. He did not wake, but the place he was in his sleep changed. She sat until first light showed at the window, and then took the chair back to her side and lay down for 2 more hours. When she came out in the morning he was already up, the fire fed, water heating on the stove. He was at the table cleaning the bore of his sharps with a cloth and a rod, the same methodical attention he gave to everything. He said nothing about the night. She said nothing either. But after breakfast, while she was washing the tin plates, She heard him moving furniture, and when she turned, he was carrying the chair from the far corner of the room, the one that had sat unused against the east wall since before she could remember, and positioning it beside the stove on the opposite side from hers, at the same angle, facing the fire. She looked at the chair. She looked at him. He was already on his way outside with the axe. She put the placed chair into her accounting and turned back to the plates and did not comment on it. But something in the structure of the morning had rearranged, and she noticed it, and she filed the noticing away carefully in a place she had not opened in a long time. The trapline lessons began on day 14. His line ran along the eastern bench where the creek narrowed and the willows made a sheltered passage that small game used when the open ground became hostile. He checked and reset it every 3 days. She had stated she was coming along on the next run, and he had accepted this without discussion, which she chose to interpret as agreement. The snow off the main trail was knee-deep in the compressed sections and thigh-deep in the depressions, and she wore her father's canvas overalls over her wool skirts and managed. Eli moved through the snow with the precision of a man who has learned to read the surface beneath for what it actually is rather than what it appears. Choosing compressed ground over loose, reading the topography for what the cold had done to it overnight. She watched how he set the traps. The position relative to the corridor the animals used, the depth of the set, the trigger tension, the way he covered the pan with a membrane of snow thin enough to give under a rabbit's weight, but thick enough to hold no human impression. She was quick with it. She always had been. Her father had noticed this when she was a girl. The way information went in and stayed, organized itself into systems she could access later. He had fed it accordingly, teaching her everything the land required: animals, weather, water, the machinery of a working property. She had his mind, or at least the part of it that found the leverage point in any given system and used it. By the 3rd day she was setting the traps herself, and Eli was watching from a step back. On the 4th day he told her that trigger tension was off. He showed her the adjustment, his hands correcting the set she had made, and the adjusted version was cleaner, and she watched his demonstration, and then looked at his hands, and then looked at his face. He was looking at her hands, not her face, making sure the mechanical correction was clear. She understood the correction, but she also understood, with the particular clarity of someone who had spent 3 years reading solitude in its many forms, that the trigger tension was not actually wrong. She had set it at the low end of the acceptable range rather than the middle, but the variance was within tolerance. He had found a teaching moment because the teaching was not yet finished, not because the error existed. She did not say this. She adjusted the tension as he showed her and asked, "Like this?" in a tone that gave him nothing. "Better," he said. She moved to the next position and pretended not to have seen what she had seen, because sometimes what a person needs is to give something, and she understood now that what he needed was the small daily exchange of useful knowledge, the only currency he currently trusted. And because she was honestest with herself in the private hours, she acknowledged that she was also not in a hurry for the lessons to end. This was a new piece of information about herself. She received it without comment and kept moving through the snow. On day 17, the storm came in from the northwest. Not the inconvenient weather that Wyoming produces as a matter of routine, but the weather it produces when it intends to demonstrate the distance between inconvenience and genuine threat. The temperature dropped 15 degrees in 2 hours. The wind off the ridge drove snow horizontal, closing down the yard to a white wall 20 feet past the porch rail. They were both inside before it fully arrived. The cabin was tight. Her father had built it to be double-chinked logs and a roof designed to shed rather than accumulate. But the storm found its ways in regardless, cold making itself known at the floor level, at the window frames, through the spaces around the stovepipe where it passed through the roof. Eli fired the stove twice when wind drove back down the pipe and killed the flame, each time relighting with the match struck against his thumbnail, a motion so automatic that she understood it had been reflex for years before she watched it become one. She made real coffee, not the boiled grain substitute she had been stretching her supply with for 2 weeks. The storm had the effect of making you want to use the things you had been saving, as though the small generosity was a counterweight to the violence outside. They sat on opposite sides of the stove in the early dark of the storm afternoon. the oil lamp between them throwing a circle of yellow that was warm in a way the world outside the window was not. She had been carrying the question about Ruth for 11 days. She had been turning it over in those 11 days, finding its edges, deciding whether she had the right to ask it and what she would do with the answer. Tell me about her. She kept her eyes on the coffee cup. She did not soften it or make it optional. Both of those things would have made it easier to decline. The storm worked at the walls. The lamp flame moved in a draft. Eli was quiet long enough that she had begun drafting the things she would say to move them past the silence, and then he spoke. Her name was Ruth. Ruth Ann Hadley. Before we married. She was from Cheyenne. Her father ran a hardware concern on the main street there. He looked at the fire. I met her when I came through selling the first season's pelts. She had a laugh that was too loud for the situations that produced it. She thought that was a flaw she needed to correct. He paused. It was the best thing about her. Clara waited. I had land in Montana Territory. Creek property, good timber access. We built the cabin the first fall together. She was better at the construction than I was, which she mentioned on a regular basis. She was right. He set the coffee cup on the floor beside his chair. I was running a line in the hills above the property. 3 days out, 3 back, comfortable margin. Snow came in fast on the 3rd day. Not unusual, I'd been caught before. But this time it came with a slide at the Bannock Pass switchback. I came out the long way, 6 days instead of 3. The wind hit the north wall with a sound like something that intended to continue. She was gone when I got back. The boy too, he had come early. Neither of them lasted through it. He said it with the flatness of someone who has spoken a thing so many times in an attempt to understand it that the words have been worn smooth by the passage. The cabin was cold. The fire had been out for 2 days. Clara looked at the fire and thought about what the specific shape of that return would be. The 6 days crossing slide country, the last ridge above the property, the approach to the cabin door, the particular quality of cold that is different from weather cold. I buried them under the big spruce on the south side of the property. He picked up the coffee again, marked it right. Then I lit the cabin. She looked up. You burned it. I couldn't live in it. Simple. The decision of a man who understood that some spaces become permanently impossible and that the honest response to an impossible space is to end it. I went up into the Wind River Range the week after. First winter was about deciding whether to stay alive. I decided yes. Kept deciding for 6 years. He looked at the fire. The storm pressed at the walls. 2 years ago I went into a ravine off the eastern bench above the line cabin. Femur, clean break with the bone through the skin. The same tone he would use to report a problem with a trap set, factual, without inflation. Lay there 2 days. Wolves working the rim above, waiting on the outcome. I set the bone myself with a pine branch and a leather strap and got back to the cabin. 3 miles, she said. The words arrived before she chose them. He looked at her. 3 miles. On a broken femur, the wolves had a preference for a different ending. He looked at the fire again. I had a different preference. She was quiet. She looked at the man sitting across from her in the lamp's circle. This enormous, scarred, patient person who had walked out of a tree line 3 weeks ago and altered the course of what would have happened to her, and who had not asked her for anything in return, and who was sitting here now in the warmth of her stove, telling her the hardest things about himself, as though they were simply the truth, and the truth was simply available. Dying isn't the worst of it, he said. His voice had dropped further, pitched now for only this room and only this moment. The worst part is that when you call out, the only thing that answers is the timber. The lamp flame steadied. Clara turned her coffee cup between her palms. I burned the bread for 3 years, she said. She watched him follow the apparent shift in direction. Not always. Maybe 1 in 3 times I got it right. The rest I'd pull it out too late and the bottom would be black. She looked at the cup. I ate it anyway. You don't waste flour out here. He was looking at her now. You ate the burnt pieces, she said. A long pause in which the only sounds were the storm and the fire. I know, he said. 2 words with nothing extra attached to them. No pity, no charity, no calculation. The simple record of a man who had watched her fail at a small thing and had eaten around the failure without comment, because the failure was not the relevant information. Something moved in her chest that she was not prepared for. She looked away from him fast, toward the dark window where the storm was pressing its white weight against the glass. Why did you come down from the mountains? Not the practical version he had given earlier, the femur, The wolves, the 2 days in the ravine. The real question underneath that one, he was quiet with it. I was tired of being the only thing that answered, he said, looking at the fire. 7 years is a long time to have every conversation with weather and timber and silence. She looked at him in the lamp's unsteady light and understood something about him he had not said directly and was not going to say directly. The coming down from the Wind River Range had been harder than setting his own broken femur in a frozen ravine. Surviving without something is a skill you develop through repetition. Choosing to stop surviving without it, choosing to walk back into the range of loss, that required a different order of courage entirely. She didn't say any of that. She finished the last of her coffee. The bread is better now, she said. The corner of his mouth moved, not quite a smile. Near enough to one that she would file it in the category of smiles anyway and take it out later. Garrett came through on snowshoes in the grey hour before proper dawn, which told Clara everything about the urgency of what he carried before he opened his mouth. She heard him on the porch and had the Winchester off the wall and the hammer back before the knock came. 3 years alone on this property had recalibrated her relationship with unexpected sounds, particularly in the dark, particularly since 3 weeks ago. She held the rifle at the door for a moment, then recognized the knock. 2 short, 1 long, the way Garrett always announced himself, a habit from his years running lines in country where men sometimes shot at sounds before identifying them. She opened the door. He came in trailing cold and the smell of snow-wet canvas, stamping his boots on the threshold. 60 years old, lean in the way of men who have never stopped moving, with a beard the color of ash and eyes that had spent decades reading weather and animal sign, and had developed an accuracy about both that extended to other things. He did not sit. He did not accept the coffee she moved to offer. Rec was in Harlow 3 days ago, he said. He kept his voice at the register of someone delivering information that needed to be received without interference from the noise of reaction. Not asking about the property this time. Asking about a man. Big. Fur coat. Runs lines in the Eastern Canyon country. He looked past her toward the stove, where the bedroll was visible. I'd guess he got a description from one of the 3 he sent back. Clara set the coffee pot down. He was drinking with 2 men I don't know, Garrett continued. Long coats, low iron. The kind of men who don't work for wages, they work for outcomes. Hargrove's regulators wear the same look. He pulled his gloves back on. Crane's not done. He's just recalibrating. She walked him to the door and watched him cross the yard and take the east trail back into the canyon timber. His snowshoe tracks cut a clean line across the white of the yard and then disappeared into the tree line. And then there was only the yard and the frost and the coming light. She stood at the window for a long time after. Eli came in from the barn while she was still standing there. He read her before he read the room, the set of her shoulders, the particular stillness that was not calm but the contained version of something else, and he asked no preliminary questions. She told him what Garrett had said. He sat with it, not visibly, not in any way that could be observed from the outside. But she had learned in 3 weeks to read his processing the way you read moving water, by the surface changes that indicate what the current is doing underneath. He was turning it over, looking at it from the angles that mattered. Rec won't come the same way twice, he said finally. He came with men who worked for opportunity. He'll come back with men who work for money, which is a different thing. Men who work for money are harder to discourage and easier to predict. He looked at the window. He also won't come when I'm here and the arithmetic is visible. He'll wait for you to leave. Yes. She crossed her arms. Then don't leave, he looked at her. She looked back. The axe blade needs a grinding wheel, he said. The whetstone has done what it can and we're at 2 weeks of flour. Maybe less if the winter runs long, which it will. Salt's lower than it should be. And your wrist needs Fenner to look at it before we're locked in completely. If the tendon's compromised and you don't know the extent of it, you'll make decisions this winter based on what you think you can do and you'll be wrong about some of them. Those things can wait, the flour can't. And neither can the wrist. She stood with this. The logic was exact and she could find no purchase against it, which was a specific frustration she was becoming familiar with in regard to this man. The way his reasoning closed off the available counterarguments, not by overwhelming them but by simply being accurate. Rec is building towards something, Eli said. Building takes time. He won't move in the next 3 days. I'll be there and back before he's ready to act. If you go, she said, measuring each word, you leave the Winchester, not the shotgun, the rifle. Something in his face registered the precision of this. He had been running the same calculation about which weapon to leave her and had arrived at the same answer, and her having arrived there independently was information he was filing. Before I go, he said, tell me what you know about the north approach. All of it. They spent an hour at the table with a rough map she drew from memory. The ridge line, the bench, the gap in the timber where the north trail opened into the upper yard. She told him where the sight lines were good and where they broke down. She told him about the stand of scrub oak on the western fence line that created a blind spot from the east window. She told him that crows roosted in the big pines above the north gap and came off the branches in a mass when something large moved through, and that the mass departure was visible from the cabin windows several minutes before anyone coming down that trail would reach the yard. He listened without interrupting. When she finished, he said, the crows. That's what you watch. That's what I watch. He nodded. He left the next morning before first light, the draft horse in the traces of the flat sled, the runners cutting clean lines through the overnight snow. She stood on the porch and watched him take the east trail toward Harlow, the outline of him diminishing in the pale early light until the timber closed around the sled, and then there was only the trail and the marks he had left in it. The Winchester was inside, leaning against the wall beside the east window. She had checked the chamber before he left, and he had watched her check it, and neither of them had commented on this. She went inside and began the day. The first day of his absence was manageable in the way that first days of things are manageable, held up by the structure of routine, by the existence of tasks that required completion regardless of the larger situation. She ran the trap line on the eastern bench, pulled 2 rabbits, reset the sets with the trigger tension she had learned was correct, came back before the light changed, fed the horse, started the bread, did not look at the bedroll beside the stove. The second day the wind picked up from the northwest and a new layer of snow came down through the afternoon, covering the sled tracks in the east yard and closing the trail to visual confirmation of anyone using it. She moved the Winchester to the window seat where she could reach it without crossing the room. She checked the chamber again, which she understood was not about the chamber. The chamber was fine. The chamber had been fine 12 hours ago. But about the need to do something with her hands that was specific and purposeful. That night she slept in the rocking chair, not because the cot was unavailable. The cot was available. But the rocking chair faced the door, and from it she could see both windows without moving, and the chair had the additional property of being uncomfortable enough that she would not sleep through anything significant. She woke twice in the night to the wind making sounds against the door frame, and both times she was at the window with the rifle before she was fully conscious, and both times there was nothing in the yard but snow and dark and the wind doing what wind does. On the third day she stopped, pretending she was not counting. 3 days was what he had said. The road conditions would determine whether it became 4, and the road conditions were poor. She ran through the calculation. Harlow was a day's drive in good conditions. He had left before first light. He would need time at the hardware store, at the mill for flour, at Fenner's for the other supplies. A night in Harlow, then the drive back. 3 days was accurate if the road was cooperative. 4 was accurate if it was not. The road was not cooperative. She knew this because she had been watching the weather for 3 years, and she knew what 3 days of northwest wind did to the east trail. She put more wood in the stove and went to bed at a reasonable hour and did not sleep reasonably. The 4th morning she was up before dawn. She built the fire and put the water on and stood at the window with her coffee cup and watched the east trail emerge from darkness into the gray pre-dawn as the light came up through the canyon gap. The sky was the color of old pewter. The snow on the yard was unbroken. The trail was unbroken. Nothing had come through in the night. She was still at the window when the crows lifted off the north pines. Not 1 or 2 startled birds. The entire population of the big timber above the north gap, 20 or 30 of them, erupting upward in a single dark mass and filling the pre-dawn with the overlapping alarm that crows produce when something large and purposeful has moved through their territory. The sound of it reached her through the window glass, muffled but unmistakable, and she was moving before the sound finished Winchester off the window seat. Chamber checked. Brass visible, confirmed. She went to the east window first for the angle on the north approach, pressing herself to the wall beside the frame and looking out at an oblique angle that kept her back from the glass. 5 horses on the bench, coming down through the timber in single file, using the tree cover the way men use it when they have thought about being seen and have decided against it. She identified Rec by the buffalo coat, the distinctive silhouette of a man riding in the center of a formation rather than at its head, flanked, buffered, behind the people he paid to absorb consequences. Around him, 4 men in long coats, riding with the relaxed posture of people who are professionally comfortable with what they are about to do. Not drifters, not men who work for circumstance. The long coats and the low-slung iron and the deliberate pace said what Garrett's description had said. Men who work for outcomes. She moved through the cabin with her back to the walls, not running, keeping her footfall quiet, checking the shotgun above the stove, loaded, both hammers down, and then back to the east window to track the progress of the 5 horses down the bench. They were 3 minutes from the yard. She calculated. 1 woman, 1 rifle, a wrist that had healed to functional but not to full strength. 5 men, 4 of whom were being paid to be effective. The cabin walls were 3 inches of solid pine, which was meaningful cover if she stayed inside them. The east window gave her the best angle on the north approach. The west window covered the yard's far side. If they split and came around the barn, the sound of the sled came from the east trail. She heard it before she saw it, the particular rhythm of a loaded flat sled on packed snow, wooden runners on frozen ground, the cadence she had been listening for since the second morning. She moved to the south window. Eli came out of the east timber into the yard. He was on the bench seat with the reins in his hands, the draft horse blowing steam, flour sacks and salt blocks arranged in the sled bed. He saw the riders on the north bench before the sled had fully cleared the tree line. She watched the moment of recognition, the small adjustment in how he held himself, the rapid reading of numbers and positions. He did not turn the sled around. He pulled the horse to a stop in the center of the yard and sat for a moment, looking at 5 men working their way down the bench. Then he wrapped the reins around the brake handle and stepped down from the sled. He did not move toward the cabin. He stood in the yard in his elk-hide coat and let them come to him, which was either the decision of a man with a plan or the decision of a man who understood that the geometry of the yard required him to be where the riders would arrive, rather than where he preferred to be, and in either case produced the same outcome. Eli Strand, alone, standing between her door and 5 armed men. She looked at the west window, then the east window, then the cabin door. She thought about what he had told her. The walls are 3 inches of solid pine. She thought about 4 men in long coats and the professional patience with which they had come down the bench. She thought about Eli standing in the open yard with the sled horse between him and cover, one man managing an arithmetic that did not favor him. She thought about the floor her father built and what it had felt like to be pressed into it. She kicked the door open and stepped onto the porch with the Winchester at her shoulder. The cold arrived on her face all at once, immediate, total, the specific bite of a Wyoming morning that has decided to make its temperature known. The air tasted of iron and the coming snow that the northwest sky had been promising for 2 days. The yard spread out before her, white and flat, and marked only by Eli's boot prints from the sled to where he stood, and beyond him the 5 horses were pulling up at the yard's edge. Rex's voice came down before anyone reached the fence line. Strand. He said the name with the weight of a man who has done his research, who has assembled a file, who knows that naming someone is a form of ownership. Mr. Crane asked me to give you one more opportunity. You could be working for him rather than against him. Men with your particular set of abilities are something he has a use for. Ellie looked at him from across the yard. He did not look at Clara on the porch, which she understood was not indifference but discipline. Looking at her would tell the 5 riders where the second position was. You wasted your ride, Eli said. His voice carried without effort in the cold air. Take your men back up the north trail. Rec pulled his buffalo coat straighter, a small gesture of adjustment that was also a signal. The 4 men in long coats spread slightly, not dramatically, just enough to establish that they were not a cluster but a formation. One drifted toward the barn side of the yard, which would put the barn between him and the cabin and compromise her angle. Clara shifted the Winchester's barrel 2 degrees and settled her sight on the center of his chest and waited. Mr. Crane's patience has a defined end, Rex said. He was looking at Eli, which meant he had not yet located Clara on the porch, which meant she had the advantage of his ignorance, for however many seconds remained before someone looked up and removed it. This property will transfer. The only variable is how that process goes for the people currently on it. Eli reached behind the sled seat. The 10-gauge came up in his right hand. Double-barreled, short, the model designed for stopping charging grizzlies. The model that operates on the principle that there are situations where precision is less important than absolute authority. He did not point it at anyone in particular. He held it in the way of a man who has already decided and is waiting for the other side to reach the same conclusion. Rex looked at the 10-gauge. He looked at the 4 men around him. He said, with the flatness of a man issuing a direction he had prepared, "Kill him." The man on Rex's right raised his sharps. Clara fired. The Winchester kicked against her shoulder and found the place in her collarbone that had not yet finished healing and delivered its full opinion about that, and she worked the lever and the brass case spun away into the cold air, and she was already acquiring the next target when she saw what the first shot had done. The man with the sharps was down in the snow, his rifle skidding away from him, both hands going to his collarbone, not dead. Down the 10-gauge went off. The sound of it was not like a gunshot, it was like a conclusion. The pressure wave moved through the cold air as a physical force, and the concussion rattled the window behind her and knocked loose snow from the porch rail in a single white sheet. The nearest hired man left his saddle backward and did not return to it. The horses went to pieces, all of them at once, the animal panic that firearms produce in horses who have not been trained to absorb the sound at close range, and the yard became a confusion of wheeling bodies and thrown snow and men trying to impose order on animals that had stopped accepting orders. One of the long-coat men, the one who had been drifting toward the barn, was fighting his horse with both hands, which meant both hands were occupied with something other than his weapon, which was the most useful thing that had happened in the last 30 seconds. She found him in her sights and held. He got the horse turned and she tracked him, and he made the calculation that she was tracking him. And he made the further calculation that the barn offered cover, and he rode for it hard, which took him out of the yard and out of the immediate situation and reduced the active count by 3 left. Rex and 2 hired men. One of the remaining hired men put his horse between himself and the 10-gauge and fired twice from the saddle. Fast shots, poorly aimed, the product of a frightened horse and a man managing too many variables simultaneously. The first went wide of Eli by 3 feet. The second did not go wide. She saw Eli stagger, the high left arm near the shoulder. The dark spread visible even across the yard. She felt the sight waver in her hands and steadied it by force. Because the sight wavering would not help him and steadying it might. He did not drop the 10-gauge. He leveled it at the man who had shot him, and the man looked at the 10-gauge at this range, and made the same calculation the barn rider had made and acted on it, spurring his horse hard for the north gate. The gate was open. He went through it without stopping. That left Rex, and Rex's horse was already moving. She could see it. The animal had been positioned for this from the beginning, pointed north, because Rex had planned his exit before he planned his entrance, because that was the kind of man he was. He was spurring now, the buffalo coat spreading behind him as the horse accelerated, and he was going to make the gate in 4 seconds. And then he was going to be in the north timber, and then he was going to be a problem for another day. A problem that would arrive again with more men and a more refined plan, and Eli dropped the empty 10-gauge and ran, 3 strides across the snow, each one covering a distance that should not have been available to a man his size with a fresh bullet wound in his left arm. He closed the angle to Rex's horse in the time it took the animal to cover 20 feet, and his right hand went up and caught the back of Rex's buffalo coat, and he planted his boots heat. He did not try to stop the horse. He did not try to match the horse's momentum. He simply stopped moving and let the physics work, and the saddle girth, good leather, but not engineered for the sudden subtraction of the man it was carrying from the horse it was attached to, gave way with a crack that was audible across the yard. Rex and the saddle came free together. The horse bolted through the gate, stirrups swinging empty. Rex hit the frozen ground of the yard. He hit it with the full force of a man who had been moving at speed and was suddenly not, and the impact had a sound and a quality that told Clara, even from the porch, that something structural had been decided. He lay on his back in the snow with his coat half off. His mouth opened and closed. His chest moved in shallow, irregular increments. He did not try to get up. He could not try to get up. Eli stood over him. He said nothing. He looked at the man on the ground with the expression of someone who has completed a necessary task and is confirming the completion. Not anger, not triumph. The specific finality of a closed account. The yard went quiet. Powder smoke drifted across the white ground in a thin haze, catching the morning light and then dissolving in it. From somewhere in the north timber came the last diminishing sound of two horses putting distance between themselves and this yard. The horse that had dragged one of the hired men out through the gate was gone, and she did not hear that man anymore. Clara lowered the Winchester. Her shoulder was sending a detailed report about the recoil that she was not currently able to address. Her hands had begun the particular trembling that hands do when the body has been running on something it has now used up and is asking, with some urgency, to be allowed to stop. She breathed through it. She let the cold air be present and immediate and real, because real was what she needed right now. Not the extended emergency state that had been running her for the past 10 minutes, but the actual, specific present of this yard and this morning and what it contained. She walked down the porch steps. She crossed the yard toward him. He turned when he heard her boots on the packed snow, and he looked at her face before he looked at anything else. And she understood this was an assessment. Was she hit? Was she intact? Was everything that needed to be functional still functional? She gave him her face straight on so he could read it clearly. She was intact. She was functional. She was angrier than she had been in a long time, though she was not yet certain at whom. I told you to stay inside. His voice was rougher than his ordinary register, the cold air and the shoulder having their say. I don't run. The words arrived with the certainty of something that had been true for 30 years and had simply found its occasion. I told you that the first day. She reached out and took his right forearm. Firm. A grip with purpose. She looked at the left shoulder, where the flannel had gone dark and wet from the seam downward, still spreading with the patient persistence of something that intended to be dealt with. You're bleeding. It's a graze. It's a wound. She held his arm and did not adjust the grip. Come inside. He looked down at her hand on his arm with the expression he used for things that arrived outside his expectations. Small, swift, the nearest thing to surprise his face aloud. Then his right hand came up. Not toward her face, not toward her arm, but to the back of her neck above her coat collar. Not pressing, not steering, just resting there, the weight of it enormous and specific and present. You shoot straight, he said. Low, rough, the sound of a man stating what he has observed. Her throat did something she had not asked it to do. She let it happen and did not try to manage it away. You were standing in the open like a man who had forgotten what guns were invented for, she said. And her voice broke at the edges of the last word despite her best effort. Something moved through his chest. A vibration that was the arrested beginning of a sound, stopped before it arrived by the shoulder's immediate opinion on the subject. He winced. He did not pull away. Inside, she said. Now he followed her. She put the rifle against the wall inside the door and got the lamp turned up to its full reach and told him to sit, which he did with the careful deliberateness of a man incorporating new information about his own physical state. She found the whiskey and the needle and the waxed linen thread from the sewing kit her mother had left her. She pushed the flannel off his left her. The wound was a channel through the outer muscle of the upper arm. Not the joint, not the bone. A deep furrow that had bled heavily and would continue to require attention for weeks, but would heal completely with correct management. The bullet had passed through, which was the preferable outcome. She had seen worse and had not spent significant time on those either. She poured the whiskey directly onto the wound. He did not make a sound. This told her something about his relationship with pain that she was already coming to understand. That he had reorganized it, at some point in the years on the Wind River Range, from emergency into information, and that the reorganization was now permanent. He received pain the way he received weather, as a condition to be accounted for rather than reacted to. She threaded the needle in the lamp's light. This is going to be unpleasant, she said. I've had worse. I know, you've told me. She looked at him across the wound. That doesn't make this not what it is. He looked at the fire and said nothing else. She closed the wound in 8 stitches, small and tight. the kind that minimized the scar rather than simply the gap, and he was still for all of it with the stillness of a man who has learned that movement is counterproductive and has chosen accordingly. When she tied off the last stitch and cut the thread, she heard him release a breath that was the first sound he had made throughout. She wrapped it with strips of the cotton sheeting she had been cutting for bandages since the morning she bound her own ribs. The fire had built while she worked, and the room was warm now in the specific way of a small space with adequate fuel, and the lamp's light had a quality that bore no relationship to the violence that had occupied the yard 20 minutes ago. She sat back and looked at the wrapped shoulder and the soot-darkened hands and the large frame in the wooden chair, and she was tired in the way that goes past the physical, the exhaustion of sustained alertness releasing all at once. Crane is going to hear about this within a week, she said. Yes, he'll have to decide whether continuing is worth what it costs him to explain. She looked at the fire. 4 men who come back without their outcome and without 2 of their number. Wreck in my yard with a damaged spine. The cost of the regulators on top of what he's already spent, she paused. Men like Crane run figures. They don't run on principle, which means they don't fight on it either. Ellie looked at her. He wanted this property because the numbers worked, she continued. The numbers just changed on him. But he won't stop because of what happened this morning. He'll stop because of what this morning costs him to account for. She stood and went to the window and looked out at the yard, where the evidence of the morning was still present in the snow. I need to give him something that makes the accounting worse than the alternative. What do you have? She crossed to the woodpile beside the stove and moved 3 of the top pieces. Underneath, wrapped in an oilcloth, were 6 survey stakes, iron-tipped, marked with Crane's survey company's stamp, the kind driven into ground to establish the perimeter of a claimed boundary. She set them on the table. I found these on the South Creek bank in October, she said. Pulled them the same afternoon. I didn't know whose they were then, not with certainty. I know now, she looked at him. They established that Crane's men were on my property conducting a survey without my knowledge or consent. That's trespass at minimum. Combined with what Rec has done here twice, it becomes a pattern that a court would find interesting. Ellie looked at the stakes. He looked at her. You've been holding these since October, he said. I hold things until I know what they're worth. The expression that crossed his face then was the one she had seen twice before and nowhere else. The swift, small revision of a man updating his understanding of something he thought he had already fully assessed. He looked at the stakes and then at her and then back at the stakes, and when he spoke, his voice had something in it that was not quite amusement but occupied the same neighborhood. You have been thinking about this a long time, he said. 3 years alone on a property someone wants. She sat back down. You learn to think past the immediate problem. She wrote the letter that afternoon at the kitchen table, using the same pen she kept for the property accounts. She was direct. She declined any offer before it arrived. She described the survey stakes, their location when found, their current location in her possession, and the date of their discovery. She noted her awareness of what they established legally and her present intention not to initiate proceedings, provided that Crane's interest in her property concluded immediately and permanently. She wrote it in the flat, unornamented language of someone who understands that legal weight comes from precision rather than force. She sealed it and sent it with the next rider who came through the valley, a freighter heading north toward Harlow 2 days later. Aldous Crane received it, and after that the valley was quiet in the way that a held breath is quiet. Not peaceful, but suspended, the silence of a calculation being run. Doc Fenner came from Harlow on the 3rd day after the yard. He was 60 years old with a grey beard, kept trimmed to professional standards and hands that were steady in the way that has nothing to do with youth and everything to do with having done a thing long enough that the doing becomes the steadiest part of you. He came in his own sled with his medical bag on the seat beside him, and he did not appear surprised by what he found, which was either the equanimity of a man who has been a frontier doctor long enough to stop being surprised or evidence that Harlow had already assembled its own account of recent events from the pieces that had arrived there. He looked at Eli's shoulder, looked at Clara's stitching, looked at Eli. Your wife's work is better than most of what I do with trained hands, he said. Neither of them corrected the first word of that sentence. Fenner looked at Rec, who had been moved to the barn the second day, not out of any particular consideration for his comfort, but because the barn was warmer than the yard and closer for the purposes of medical assessment. His examination was thorough and his conclusions were delivered without decoration. The lower vertebrae had sustained damage that would not resolve. Rec would walk eventually, with assistance, given time and adequate care. He would not ride. He would not be Crane's instrument in this valley or any other. When Fenner finished, he straightened up and looked at Clara. "I'll take him back with me. He needs more than a barn." He paused. "You should know that what happened here is known in Harlow. These things travel faster than sleds, what's being said. That Dolan Rec came to this property twice and left worse both times." Fenner latched his bag. "And that there's a man here now who appears to have opinions about that continuing." He looked at Eli without particular judgment. People in Harlow tend to respect opinions that are held with that kind of consistency. He loaded Rec into his sled with the efficiency of a man who has transported damaged people in cold weather before and has developed a methodology for it. Clara stood on the and watched the sled take the south trail and diminish into the distance, and the particular quality of what she felt watching it go was not relief in the simple sense, but something more like the closing of a door that had been open and rattling for a long time. Not gone, closed. The weeks that followed had a different texture than the weeks before. The work was the same. The cold was the same. December arriving with the particular authority of Wyoming deep winter, settling in without apology and showing no inclination toward moderation. The trap line needed checking every 3 days. The horse needed feeding. The stove needed wood. The bread needed watching. The bread was not burning anymore. She had noticed this at some point in the second week after the yard, pulling a perfect loaf from the pan and holding it in the lamplight, and understanding that the correction had happened gradually enough that she could not identify the specific morning it became reliable. She held the loaf and thought about the mornings she had pulled out the burnt ones and eaten the acceptable pieces and given him the rest without comment. And about the fact that he had eaten the burnt pieces without comment, and about how that particular arrangement had operated without either of them naming it or making it into a transaction. She thought about this more than she thought about the yard, more than she thought about Rec, more than she thought about the stakes and the letter, and the silence from Crane's direction that was, she understood, the silence of a man revising his figures. The thing she thought about most was the chair beside the stove. Not the chair itself. The chair was pine and unexceptional, but the fact of it. The fact that he had seen what the situation required and provided it without being asked, without making it into a statement, without waiting to see whether she would acknowledge it. The chair was there the same way the water bucket was there, and the rabbit had been there on the first morning, and the stove was lit when she came out of the partition, and the trap line ran correctly, even when she set the tension slightly off, and he invented a correction to give her. She understood, in the way that things become understood when you have been moving around them long enough to finally see them from the right angle, that she had been receiving something for several weeks and had been calling it assistance and practicality, and the reasonable division of necessary labor, and that she had been calling it those things because those were names she knew how to hold without the names changing anything. She was not certain what to call it instead, but she was becoming certain that the name she had been using was insufficient. December gave way to January in the way of deep winter transitions, not gradually but by the accumulated weight of weeks. The cold deepened. The days shortened to their minimum, and then, almost imperceptibly, began their return. The snow on the ridge remained constant and absolute, but the quality of the light in the afternoons shifted by increments toward something that had, very distantly, the suggestion of duration. They had settled into the cabin the way furniture settles, finding the positions that the space and the use required, without drama, without announcement. He on the bedroll beside the stove, she behind the partition on the cot. The 2 chairs angled toward the fire, the tools distributed between them according to what the day required. They talked more than they had in November. Not expansively, neither of them was built for expansion, but the silences had changed in character. In November, the silences had been the silences of 2 people managing the gap between them. Now they were the silences of 2 people who have enough shared context that silence carries content, that what is not said is still communication. She noticed the way she began accumulating things to tell him throughout the day. The particular cast of afternoon light on the east ridge that occurred for about 20 minutes in the hour before sunset, a low-angle winter gold that made the snow surface look like hammered metal. The way the draft horse had begun coming to the barn door when she heard Eli crossing the yard, which was a behavior the horse had never shown for anyone else. Small things, ordinary things, the kind that pass through a solitary person's awareness and exit without having had anywhere to land. They had somewhere to land now. She noticed this. She noticed herself noticing it. She filed Ajot's observation in the same careful place she had been filing the others, and closed the drawer and went back to whatever the day required. But the drawer was getting full, and she was going to have to decide what to do about its contents eventually. The letter from Crane's solicitor arrived on a Tuesday in mid-January, carried by a young man who had clearly not planned his wardrobe for the distance he had ridden. The letter was 2 paragraphs in the clipped, formal language of legal correspondence. The first paragraph made an offer, a number that was significant and that she filed away as evidence of how much Crane had thought the property was worth, which was itself information. The second paragraph referenced obliquely the matter of certain survey equipment that might have been mislaid. She read it twice. She set it on the table. She went to the woodpile and retrieved the oilcloth bundle and set the stakes beside the letter and looked at both of them together. Ellie was at the window, watching the solicitor's clerk pace his horse in the yard. "He thinks I don't have them," she said. The way the second paragraph reads, "Yes, he's offering enough that he thinks I'll take it and he can recover the stakes in the transaction." She looked at the letter. "He's wrong on both counts." She wrote her response at the table in the same hand she had used the first time. Direct, unornamented, accurate. She declined. She described the stakes again, their condition, their location, her continued possession of them. She stated that she had no current intention of initiating legal proceedings, contingent on the permanent cessation of any interest, official or unofficial, in her property by Crane or any person or entity acting on his behalf. She gave the letter to the clerk in the yard, along with the information that he should ride fast because the northwest had the color of serious weather. She watched him go. Ellie came to stand beside her at the porch rail. "He might not accept it," she said. "He'll think about those stakes for a long time before he does anything." He looked at the clerk's diminishing figure on the south trail. A man like Crane doesn't move on a problem while he still believes there's a legal dimension he hasn't controlled. She turned back inside. He followed. That evening was the first evening she could remember since November that did not carry, somewhere in its structure, the weight of what Crane might do next. The weight was not gone. She was not so optimistic as to believe it was gone, but it had shifted, the way a load shifts when you have found the correct position for it. Still present. No longer pressing on the same places, they sat after dinner the way they had been sitting after dinner for weeks. Him with the knife and the pine, her with the account book she kept for the property records. The lamp between them, the fire in the stove, the wind outside doing what wind does in Wyoming in January. She looked up and found him already looking at her. She held his look without adjusting it. "When the snow clears," he began. "April," she said. "Late March if the year is mild." "This year won't be mild," he acknowledged this without contesting it. "When the pass opens, I could go back up into the Wind River range. Spring is good trapping. It's the work I know." She closed the account book. "Is that what you want to do?" He looked at the piece of pine he had been working. "No," she waited. "I want to know if you want a person to stay." He said it to the pine and then raised his eyes to her. "Not from obligation. Not because the winter requires it or the wood needs splitting. Because you want someone in this cabin who is going to be here when the snow thaws, the fire, the lamp. Outside, the wind making its January argument against the walls." She thought about what it had cost her, over 3 years, to need nothing from anyone. How much of that cost had looked like strength from any external vantage point, and how much of it had felt, from the inside, like a life organized around the systematic removal of anything that could be lost, until only the structural remained. She thought about a man who had spent 2 days in a frozen ravine with wolves on the rim, and had arrived at the conclusion that dying wasn't the worst of it. She had her own version of that ravine, the past 3 years. Different terrain, same silence, "I've spent 3 years proving I don't need anyone," she said. She held his eyes across the table. "I proved it. That's done. That's not the question. What's the question? Whether I want someone." She looked at the closed account book. "That's the harder thing. I know it is. I don't have a method for this," she said without apology, because she was not going to apologize for accuracy. "I've been running this place on the principle that the fewer moving parts, the fewer things that break. That's a sound principle for machinery," he said. "It produces a different result in a life." She looked at him across the table in the lamp's unsteady light. This man who had appeared in her doorway in November and had proceeded without announcement to alter the terms of what this winter was. She put her hand on the table between them, palm down. Not toward him, just on the surface. He looked at it. He covered it with both of his hands, not gripping, not claiming, placing, with the care of a man who has held something he valued and lost it, and understands the weight of holding something again. They sat like that while the fire burned and the wind pressed against the walls, and the lamp threw its small, reliable circle of yellow into the winter dark of the cabin. And the silence between them was not the silence of a standoff or an ending, but the silence of something that was beginning and did not yet have a name, and neither of them required it to. February arrived without ceremony. The deep Wyoming winter did not announce its own midpoint. It simply continued, the same iron cold, the same low sky, the same wind off the ridge that found every gap in the chinking and reminded you through your feet that the ground beneath the floorboards was frozen 4 feet down. But the light was different, marginal, almost imperceptible, but present. 15 minutes more of it each day than there had been in December, the afternoons holding their gray a fraction longer before the darkness came down off the ridge and closed the valley. Clara noticed the light the way she noticed most things, by its practical consequences. The trapline could be run slightly later. The morning fire could wait an extra few minutes before the cabin went dark. Small adjustments, the kind that accumulate into a season. She and Eli drove into Harlow on the second Tuesday of February. The sled runners on packed snow produced a sound that was almost musical in the cold air, a sustained high note that varied with the density of the surface, rising where the trail had been compressed by previous traffic, dropping where new snow had settled overnight. The draft horse moved at a steady pace, blowing steam in regular puffs, her breath marking time against the white air. They had not discussed the purpose of the trip extensively. They had not needed to. Clara wanted Eli's name on the property record, not as sentiment, not as the formal acknowledgement of something they had agreed to by the lamp 2 weeks ago, though it was that too. As practical architecture. 2 names on a document were harder to challenge than one, and the challenge from Crane's direction, while quieter since her second letter, was not something she had concluded was finished. It had merely changed form, gone from active pressure to the kind of patient waiting that men with resources could afford and that she needed to account for in her planning. She had told Eli this. He had looked at the table for a moment and then said, "All right." 2 words with no performance attached to them, which was how he agreed to things that mattered. Harlow in February was a town that had retreated into itself for the winter. The main street compressed by cold into a narrow functional corridor of buildings leaning toward each other for warmth. Chimneys producing steady columns of smoke that rose straight up in the windless morning air and then bent south at altitude. 3 horses at the rail outside the general store. A freighter unloading at the feed merchant. 2 men talking outside the assay office with the posture of men who were enduring the cold out of professional obligation rather than choice. It was a small enough town that the sled attracted notice without attracting attention. People looked, assessed, returned to their business. Clara had been coming to Harlow for 3 years, and was known here in the way that solitary property owners are known in small frontier towns. Her name attached to her father's land. Her circumstances understood without being discussed in her presence. Doc Fenner's office occupied a 2-room building on the north end of the main street, the front room for patients and the back room serving as the county records office. Fenner having accepted the additional responsibility of county clerk, the same year he accepted the position of town physician, on the basis that both roles required a man who could keep information accurate and confidential, and who was going to remain in place long enough to be accountable for both. He was at his desk when they came in. writing in the ledger with the slow, deliberate hand of a man who understands that official records are permanent and approaches them accordingly. He looked up at Clara, and then at Eli, and then at Clara again, and the look he gave her contained something that was not quite a question. She told him what she needed. He found the property ledger without ceremony, page to the Boone entry. 32 acres, South Canyon, Harlow Valley. Established 1857. Transferred to Clara Marie Boone upon death of Robert Boone, November 1884, and set the ledger on the desk between them. He uncapped his pen. He asked Eli for his full name and his date of birth and his previous county of record, writing the answers in his clean vertical hand, with the attention of a man who has made enough official errors in his life to understand the cost of imprecision. Eli Strand, born March 1849, previous record, Carbon County, Wyoming Territory. Fenner wrote it all down and read it back for confirmation, and then signed the addition and dated it, and blotted the ink and closed the ledger. He stood and extended his hand to Eli. "I looked at your shoulder when you came in," he said. "You've been using it. It functions. Function and healed are not the same diagnosis." He extended his hand to Clara. "Welcome to the Valley Records, Mr. Strand." He said it with the handshake. And the handshake was the way Harlow acknowledged things that had been witnessed officially. Not ceremonial, not emotional, but durable. The gesture of a place that understood that durability was its own form of meaning. They were on their way back to the sled when Ida Marsh came out of the general store. Ida was 63 and had been running the Harlow General Store for 28 of those years. First with her husband and then, after he died of a fever in 1879, alone. She was not large, but she occupied space with the authority of someone who had decided a long time ago that the space was hers and had not revised the decision. She wore her gray hair pinned back without ornament, and her coat was the same dark wool she had been wearing since Clara could remember, maintained rather than replaced the choice of a woman who valued reliability over novelty in all things. She looked at Eli the way she looked at new merchandise. From the ground up, with the professional assessment of someone who has been evaluating quality for decades and has strong opinions about it. "You're bigger than Garrett described," she said. "Garrett tends to understate," Eli said. She looked at Clara with the particular expression of a woman who has been watching a solitary person from a respectful distance for several years and is finding the current developments satisfactory, not sentimental. Satisfied, in the way of someone whose long-held assessment of a situation has been confirmed by events. "Your father would have made him work for it," Ida said. Clara thought about this honestly. He would have asked him every question twice and listened to the second answer. "That's how your father decided whether to trust someone." Ida looked at Eli again. He asked the same question twice. If the second answer was identical to the first, he trusted you. If it was slightly different, better, more considered, he trusted you more. She pulled her coat tighter. "Come in when you have a moment. I've been holding something inside the store, which carried the layered smell of pine boards and dried goods, and the accumulated domestic history of 1,000 Wyoming winters' worth of provisioning." Ida went behind the counter without explanation, and came back with a bundle wrapped in canvas and tied with twine. "Your father ordered these the spring before he died," she said. She set the bundle on the counter between them. "He paid in full. He never came back for them. I've been keeping them in the back room." Clara untied the twine and unfolded the canvas, curtain fabric, white cotton with a small repeating pattern. Not elaborate, not decorative in the way of people who have money for decoration, but deliberate. The kind of fabric chosen by a man who had a specific purpose in mind and had matched the material to it. Her father had tried for 20 years to persuade her mother to put curtains in the cabin windows. Her mother had regarded curtains as a thing that required maintaining and had declined on practical grounds. Her father had accepted this outcome every year and had apparently, at some point in the last year of his life, decided to order the fabric anyway. Clara stood with the fabric folded in her hands. The feeling was not grief alone. It was grief and something else combined, something that occupied the same space grief did but pointed in a different direction. The recognition of being connected to a chain of intentions that extended back before her and was now extending forward. The sense of being a point in a longer line rather than its terminus. Her father had ordered curtains he did not live to hang, for windows his daughter was living behind, in a cabin his granddaughter might eventually know. He had been thinking past himself. He had always been thinking past himself. Ida was watching her from behind the counter with the patience of a woman who knows when something does not need assistance. Ellie was beside her, close enough that she was aware of him without looking. He did not say anything. She had come to understand that his silences were not the absences they appeared to be, but a form of presence. The presence of someone who was entirely there and was not going to crowd the moment with words it did not require. She folded the fabric back into the canvas. "Thank you, Ida," she said. "He paid for them, matter of fact. They were always yours. I was just keeping them until you came for them." The drive back to the property was long, and the sky had gone the color of pewter by mid-afternoon, the quality of light that precedes snow by several hours. The draft horse moved at her steady working pace, neither hurried nor slow, the runners marking 2 clean lines in the trail surface behind them. Clara sat on the bench beside Eli with the canvas bundle across her knees and the cold on her face, and the Harlow Valley opening up ahead of them as the east trail came around the bend above the creek. She had been thinking about the curtains since they left the store. Not obsessively. The way you think about something that has weight without being a problem, turning it over, feeling its dimensions. "He ordered them the spring before he died," she said. The words arrived without preamble, which was how she had come to say things to Eli when they were worth saying, directly, without the scaffolding of preparation. He had demonstrated consistently that he did not need the scaffolding. "I know." He kept his eyes on the trail ahead. "You told me." He knew I was going to be alone here. He'd been watching me manage the property for 2 years by then. He knew I was capable. She looked at the canvas in her hands, and he ordered curtains. The trail curved and the canyon walls rose on either side, the familiar geology of the approach to the property. The creek was audible below the trail, moving under its last thin skim of ice. He thought if the windows looked lived in from the outside, she said, maybe eventually it would feel that way from the inside. She paused. That was how he thought. The practical gesture aimed at an interior condition. He couldn't give me the feeling directly, so he ordered the material for it and trusted that the rest would follow. Ellie was quiet for a moment, the runners on the trail. The horse's breath. "Did he know something about the interior condition that you didn't?" he asked. She looked at the canyon walls, at the snow on the upper ridge, at the pale winter light lying across the white ground in long oblique angles. He knew me better than I knew myself in some respects. That's the privilege of 30 years of watching someone. What did he know? She thought about this honestly. He knew I was going to close things off, she said. He knew that was my instinct when things became dangerous, to remove the soft things, one by one, until only what couldn't be damaged remained. He'd watched me do it after my mother died. After James, she said her late husband's name without flinching, which surprised her slightly, and she noticed the lack of flinch and filed it. He was trying to leave something soft behind that I couldn't remove, because he'd already paid for it and it was mine, and it would be waiting. When I was ready, the cabin appeared through the last stand of pines at the head of the valley, the chimney still showing a thread of smoke from the morning fire. The sight of it had the particular quality of return. Not the neutral recognition of a landmark, but the specific recognition of a place that has a claim on you. He was right that you'd need it eventually, Eli said. He was right about most things. I told him so rarely. She looked at the cabin getting larger as they came down the final stretch of trail. That's the other thing that you find out after someone dies. Not that you loved them. You knew that while they were alive. But how often you assumed the knowing was sufficient and didn't say it. The sled came into the yard and she got down while Eli was setting the brake. She carried the canvas bundle to the porch and set it on the rail and looked at the east window. Bare. As it had been for every day of 3 years, the glass catching the flat afternoon light without filtering it. She had been taking the unfiltered version of everything for 3 years, on the principle that filtering cost something she could not afford. The principle had served her. It had also produced a particular quality of cold that she was only now, in February, beginning to understand had been a choice she was making continuously, rather than a condition she was simply enduring. She picked up the bundle and went inside. She put the curtains up the following morning. Ellie found the pine doweling in the lean-to, cut 2 lengths to fit the window spans, and handed them up to her while she worked the fabric onto the rods from the chair she had placed below each window. He did this without being asked, which was no longer remarkable. The unremarkable quality of it was itself a thing she had been noticing. The way the space of necessary asking had compressed over the months until there was almost none of it left between what needed doing and what got done. The white cotton went up in the east window first. The morning light came through the fabric and arrived at the floor changed, softer, without the hard direct quality of glass-filtered winter sun, distributed rather than concentrated. The room looked different. Not larger, not warmer in any physical sense, but inhabited in a way it had not been before, as though the fabric had introduced a new variable into the cabin's relationship with the light that came through it. She stood back, better, she said, and meant it in all the directions it applied. Eli stood in the center of the room and looked at the window. She was watching his face and she saw what moved through it. Not sudden, not dramatic, more like something surfacing from depth, the way ice moves in spring when the water underneath begins its slow return to motion. Ruth wanted curtains in the Montana cabin, he said. We talked about it. We never got to it before she died, he said it simply. Not with the flat, careful tone he had used in November, when he first told her about Ruth, the tone of a man managing the distance between himself and the content of what he was saying. He said it the way you say something that belongs to you, owned, carried, present, but no longer pressing against the inside of your chest with the specific pressure of a thing that cannot be acknowledged. She did not rush to fill the space after it. She had good taste, Clara said. The thing that happened in his face then was not grief, though grief had shaped it. It was the expression of someone who has been carrying a weight for so long that the muscles have adapted to the carrying, and then the weight has been set down, not removed permanently, not resolved into something simpler, but set down, and the muscles are reporting the unfamiliar condition of not carrying. Something like relief. Something like the first full breath after a long compression. She did, he said. They hung the west window curtains after, and the cabin became a different room in both directions. The same four walls, the same floor her father had built, the same stove and table and chairs, but with something added that changed the quality of being inside it. The light came through white cotton and became domestic. The space declared itself inhabited rather than merely occupied. She made coffee. They sat at the table the way they had been sitting at the table for 3 months, and the curtains moved slightly in the draft from the stovepipe, and the fire produced its reliable sound, and the valley outside the windows was white and cold and entirely indifferent to what was happening inside the cabin, which was its own kind of reassurance. March came in hard and went out harder, the way Wyoming months do when they have not finished what they started. The snow on the bench above the property remained deep and consolidated, the kind of snowpack that does not begin its retreat until the sun achieves a sustained angle, which in the Harlow Valley did not occur until the second week of April in a normal year, and later in the kind of year this one was determined to be. Clara knew she was carrying a child before she was certain of it. She had known it the way the body sometimes communicates information ahead of any confirmable fact. Through sensation, through a shift in the quality of her own physical awareness, through the specific morning nausea that arrived on the 3rd day of March and did not leave. She sat with the knowledge for 2 weeks, not from uncertainty about what she wanted to do with it, from the careful habit of not speaking things until she understood their full dimensions. She understood their full dimensions by the middle of March. She told him on an evening when the light was staying late enough to be noticeable, when the fire in the stove was doing its job against a cold that had begun, almost imperceptibly, to have an end somewhere in its future. They had finished dinner, and he was at the table with the knife and a piece of pine he had been working for 3 days into a shape she had not yet identified, and she was across from him with the account book she no longer actually needed to consult, but kept at the table out of a habit that had become a form of companionship. She closed the account book. I'll need Fenner to come out in the fall, she said. September, probably. October at the latest. The knife stopped. He looked at her. She held his look with the steadiness she held everything, directly, without adjustment, giving him the full information of her face. He went through it. She watched him go through it, because she had learned to read the specific sequence of his processing. The first arrival of the information, the immediate check for her condition, then the larger understanding spreading out from the center of what the information meant. Then the things the larger understanding contacted on its way outward. She let him move through all of it without rushing him toward any particular destination. Are you all right, the first thing? Always the first thing? I'm well, she said. I'm entirely well. He looked at her for a moment longer, confirming this for himself, and then he set the knife down on the table and put both hands flat on the wood and looked at them. His hands. The scarred broad palms, the thick fingers, the dark stain of work in the skin's deep grain. I had a boy, he said. In Montana. He didn't survive a day, I know. She said it quietly. You told me, I thought about him every day. For 7 years he was looking at his hands, not only about losing him, about what he would have been, what he would have looked like at 5, at 10, he paused. At some point I decided I wasn't allowed to think about that anymore, that thinking about it was a kind of taking, when I had no right to take. She understood this. The way grief, when it has been sustained long enough, begins to function as a boundary, a line you are not permitted to cross in certain directions, as though hope after a specific kind of loss constitutes a betrayal of what was lost. She had lived with a smaller version of the same boundary. Most people who had lost things had built one somewhere. You're allowed, she said. 2 words, absolute, not comfort, statement. He raised his eyes. She held his look and let the 2 words do what they were doing without adding anything to them, because they did not need anything added. He was quiet for a long time. The stove, the curtains moving in the draft. Outside, the March wind doing its patient work against the walls. If it's a girl, he said. His voice had a quality she had not heard in it before. Not softness exactly, because softness implied a previous hardness, and what she heard was something different, something that had been compressed for a long time and was now simply taking its actual shape. I'd like to call her Ruth. Clara looked at him in the lamplight. She had known him long enough now to understand what this meant, not the full weight of it, because that was his to carry, and she was not going to claim more than her portion, but the direction of it. He could say the name now to something new rather than to something lost. He could give it forward rather than holding it sealed in the past, which was the difference between a name as an anchor and a name as an honoring Ruth Strand. She said. He nodded. Just that. She reached across the table and put her hand on the back of his, not turning it over, not holding it, just placing her hand on top of his where it rested flat on the wood. He turned his hand over and enclosed hers in it, and they sat with the fire and the lamp and the curtains moving in the draft, and outside the March wind pressed against the walls of the cabin her father had built, and inside was warm and quiet and inhabited. She thought about her father ordering the curtains. She thought about him paying for them in advance and not coming back for them. And she thought about what it meant to make a provision for someone you love, that you trust will find them when they are ready for it. She thought about the account book she no longer needed to consult, and the trapline she now ran as fluently as he did, and the bread that had been right for 2 months, and the 2 chairs angled toward the fire, and the name Ruth, said not with grief but with love, which are not the same direction. She thought about the chain of intentions. Her father's extended through the curtains to this morning. Ruth's extended through Eli's 7 years on the mountain to this table. Her own extended through 3 years of hard solitude to this hand enclosed in a larger hand in the lamplight. Chains do not require every link to have known the others. They only require the holding. April announced itself not with warmth, but with light. The sustained angle finally achieved, the afternoon sun reaching the south-facing slopes and beginning, 1 degree at a time, to argue with the snowpack. The creek under the property ran loud for the first time since November, audible from the cabin in the early morning, the sound of water that has been moving under ice all winter and is now moving openly and without restraint. The snow pulled back from the south yard first, then from the east slope, then from the bench above the creek. It would be weeks yet before the North Pass was negotiable, and the upper ridge would hold snow into June. But the valley floor was showing ground, brown and saturated and alive in the way that ground is alive when it has been frozen for months, and is now receiving the first serious warmth. Eli started building the addition in the last week of April. He had drawn it out on a piece of brown paper 2 weeks before he began, a simple plan for an additional room on the south side of the cabin, where the wall received direct sun from late morning onward. He had gone through the dimensions with her, not asking for approval, they were past that, but making sure the plan accounted for everything it needed to account for. She had suggested a window facing east as well as south, so the room would have morning light as well as midday, and he had adjusted the plan without comment and begun calculating lumber. She would watch him from the porch in the early mornings with her coffee, the sound of hammer and wood in the clear spring air, the new framing going up in the incremental way of careful construction. He did not rush it. He built the way he did everything, with the settled focus of a man who understands that the quality of the work is the work, and that haste produces the kind of result that requires redoing, which is the opposite of economy. On the third morning of framing, she brought 2 cups of coffee out to the porch and set one on the rail for him, and he came over and picked it up without stopping the work entirely, drinking and assessing the frame at the same time, his eyes moving over the joints and the angles with the proprietary attention of someone who is going to live with what he is building. "South window's an inch high on the left side," he said. She looked at the frame. "I can see that from here. It'll need to come down before I put the sill in, then it'll come down." She looked at him, looking at the frame. "It's good work, Eli." He drank his coffee. He did not dismiss this or deflect it. He received it the way she had learned. He received things that were true and offered plainly, without performance, without the false modesty that is its own form of dishonesty. "It'll be good when it's finished," he said. She leaned on the porch rail and looked at the valley below the property. The creek was running full and clear, cutting its spring channel through the mud of the east bank. The scrub oak along the fence line was beginning to show the first red of new growth, the color appearing before the leaves, the color of intention. Above the ridge, the sky was the specific blue of a Wyoming April morning, the blue that exists only in high, dry country at altitude, and that she had been looking at her whole life, without once taking it for granted. Her father had stood on this porch and looked at this valley for 30 years. She was 30 years old. She thought about what he had said about the land, that it would take care of her, that she only had to not let it take her under. She understood now that he had not been talking about the land as an impersonal force, the way you talk about weather. He had been talking about the land as a place where a life could be built, if you built it right, if you stayed in it long enough to understand what it required. Taking care of you was not something the land did to you. It was something the land made possible. If you made the right decisions about what to build on it and with whom. She had taken 3 years to make the right decision, which was not 3 years wasted. It was 3 years of becoming the kind of person who could make it correctly. She heard Eli set the coffee cup on the frame behind her and pick up the hammer again, and the sound of it in the clear spring air was the sound of something being built, solid and deliberate and intended to last, and she stood on her porch in the April morning and let the creek run and the sky be blue and the work continue. And she did not think past this specific present, because this specific present was sufficient. It was more than sufficient. It was the thing she had been building toward through 3 years of hard solitude and 1 winter that had altered the terms of everything. And it was here now, in the light and the sound of the hammer and the smell of new lumber and the coffee going cold in her hands. The addition would have a window facing east and south. It would have room for a cot and room for other furniture as it became necessary. It would be finished before July, which gave them time before September to make the cabin what it needed to be for what September would bring. Ruth, if she was Ruth, someone else, if she was someone else, either way, the room would be ready. Either way, the name would be waiting, given forward rather than held back, offered to the future rather than preserved for the past. Ellie had started framing the east wall that afternoon. She could hear the hammer from inside while she made the bread, the rhythm of it steady and unhurried in the spring air, marking the time in the way that work marks time. Not by counting it, but by occupying it fully, until you look up and the afternoon has passed and something that did not exist in the morning exists now. She pulled the bread from the oven. The bottom was even and correct. The top was the color her father's bread had been, the particular brown of a thing that has been given exactly the time it needed and has used it. She set it on the table to cool and went to the door. "Bread's done," she called out across the yard. The hammer paused. "Coming," he called back. She went back inside and put the water on for coffee and set the table the way she had been setting it for 4 months. 2 plates, 2 cups, 2 chairs angled toward each other across the table's width, and she listened to his boots on the porch steps and the door opening and the room rearranged itself around his presence the way it had been rearranging itself around his presence since November, the space accounting for him as a permanent variable rather than a temporary one. He came to the table and looked at the bread and then looked at her, and the look was the look of a man who has arrived somewhere he intended to arrive and is taking a moment to register the arrival before moving on to what comes next. She cut 2 pieces. Outside, the creek ran, and the light stayed late in the way that April light stays late, and the new framing on the south wall cast a long shadow across the yard that had not existed 3 weeks ago and would be a room by July, and the valley held them in the specific way that places hold the people who have chosen to remain in them. Not gently, not easily, but completely, the way the mountains hold the snow all winter and release it in spring as the water that makes everything possible. She poured the coffee. He was already eating, working through the bread with the same steady focus he brought to all necessary things. And the cabin was warm and the curtains moved in the draft, and outside the world was conducting its slow return to the living, and in the Harlow Valley in the spring of 1888, in a cabin that had been a home and was now something more than that. 2 people sat across a table from each other and did not need to say what they both already knew, which was enough, not in the sense of barely enough, in the sense of fully enough, completely enough in all directions simultaneously, the kind of enough that a person spends a long time learning to recognize and a longer time learning to accept without looking past it for something more. The bread was right, the room was warm, the hammer would be going again in an hour. That was all of it, and it was sufficient, and it was theirs.